So a few tips on making a great forward cast. The first thing I'm going to sort of talk about is just having a great firing position, a great place to fire from. And so my favorite firing position, in my mind the best one, kind of looks like this right here. So a couple things to notice about this position. Number one, my armpit is mostly closed. I've got my elbow leading towards the target. Number two, my lower arm, my lower hand is extended away from the body, not too much like this, kind of right here, maybe about a 30 degree, 35 degree angle right there. And my top hand's about eye level. So a few reasons that is my favorite firing position. Number one, having the lower arm, the lower hand, sort of that whole lower unit extended. And the reason for that is you'll oftentimes hear in spey casting people say, oh, you're not using enough lower hand. And so by having a firing position like this, with this lower hand way in like this, you really get no path to work with. It's really hard to apply any sort of power from your lower hand. So by having that arm extended out, we get a much longer path to work with, and we can apply a lot more energy with the lower hand and get a better cast that way. So secondly, you'll notice that I actually had my armpit mostly closed and my elbow pointed towards the target. So having my elbow pointed towards the target is a great way to know that your armpit is mostly closed. Generally, if your elbow's off some other direction, you'll know that the armpit's open. So being right in like this is going to keep my elbow pointed towards the target. So why I like to have my armpit closed has to do with anchor position and tracking as well. So arriving in your firing position, it's important that as you sweep around, you keep this armpit closed. And the reason is if you make your sweep in a spey cast or come into your back cast by moving this arm way away from the body, what that ends up doing is it ends up putting your anchor oftentimes in a very different area than where you're going to be casting, and of course that really steals a lot of energy out of the cast. So generally when I'm sweeping in any of these casts or coming into my D-loop or trying to arrive in my firing position, I'm trying to make that motion with my armpit closed. And when I do that, what ends up happening most of the time is my anchor ends up in a much better position. It ends up more pointed towards the target, not directed in some other direction. So by having this hand down around where my eye is and having this 90-degree bend in my arm, I'm able to have more control over my acceleration and path and power. The more this hand sort of creeps up and this bend comes out of the elbow, we can generate less energy there. And even more importantly, a lot of times what ends up happening, if you get high enough, there's your ability to track a straight line on your forward cast sort of disappears, and you've got nowhere to go but down. Another bad thing that can happen is if your hand actually comes in behind the head, a lot of times that's going to drop your rod tip. Too much anchor on the water, not a good D-loop. The cast not as good as it could be. So the third thing I'm going to talk about is acceleration in your forward cast. So it's really important that you accelerate when you make your forward cast. And the reason is, when you're accelerating, what ends up happening is the rod tip keeps picking up speed. It keeps going faster and faster and faster. And while that's happening, what's happening is the line that's contained within the D-loop is coming forward following the rod tip. But because the rod tip's accelerating, the line is always struggling to keep up with the rod tip. And it's the difference in those two speeds that's helping to put tension into the whole casting system. So when we accelerate too much and actually hit 100% speed or try and give 100% of our power, a lot of times what happens is we're going to hit 100% speed before we get to the end of the stroke. And of course the definition of acceleration all the way through your forward stroke is to keep picking up speed and have the most speed in the end. Well, when you try and hammer it, a lot of times you hit 100% speed before the end of the stroke, and the effect of the line being pulled along by the rod tip diminishes, and instead of getting more tension, we get more slack in the cast. And so it's always important that instead of trying to hit as hard as you can, try and tension the system more by using a level of acceleration that you know you can control. So in this instance, I'll make a nice smooth acceleration that I know I can control and I get a really good result. Of course, when you hit super hard, try and hit 100% speed, a lot of times you don't get as good a result, and that's due to not tensioning the system as well as you could have with nice smooth acceleration. So the last thing I'll talk about is a little bit about the rod tip path in a Spey cast. So if you've ever taken a single hand lesson or read any books or watched any videos, one analogy that's oftentimes used is the clock analogy. So if you can imagine, I'm standing here in a clock face, noon is here, I've got my AM hours in front, my PM hours behind. You know, in single hand casting, we often say 10 to 2 between those 2 points in a straight line. And if we draw a nice straight line between those 2 points, generally we get a really nice loop shape, nice narrow loop shape and good height on the cast, a lot of good things that happen there. When we tend to creep down towards 9:30 or even 9 o'clock in our forward cast, a lot of times we'll pull the cast or the loop into a really wide shape that's really not as efficient, hits the water a lot sooner, just not very good at all. Even there, I even went more extreme than that, went right down to the water. So the idea is between your back cast and your forward cast points, 10 to 2, that you move the rod tip in a nice straight line. So straight line between the back cast and the forward cast gives us really great loop shape and good height on the cast as well. It's a great way to cast because it works a lot better when you do it that way. So in addition to the 10 to 2 analogy, which we oftentimes think of in more of a horizontal or out to the side sort of idea, it's also important that we track straight between our forward casts and our back casts in more of a straight back and straight forward plane. So what I mean by that is when I make my back cast, I want to make sure that my forward cast is generally in the opposite direction and that I'm not actually sweeping across my body and making a crooked forward cast that way. So keeping your arm close to your side in your firing position goes really a long way to helping to accomplish that. And the reason is if I take my arm way out to the side like this, even if I try and track straight coming forward, usually I'll move the rod tip in a curve. Whereas if I sweep with my armpit closed right here and I go straight forward from there, I usually get a forward cast and a back cast that are directly opposite each other, which is the most efficient way to make a forward cast. So what we want to do is really avoid slashing across the front of the body when we make these forward casts. One great indicator of that is if you finish your forward cast and your lower hand ends up on the other side of your body than your top hand, it's likely that you slashed as you came forward. So a lot of times when I'm looking to see if I've made a nice straight forward cast, I'll actually look to see that these two hands ended up on at least the same side of the body. And a lot of times I'm actually looking for my lower hand to come right under my upper arm. That's a great indicator that you made a really straight cast.